This is Poland. Known throughout the world as the country where all fever dream videos come from, with charming Slavs doing charming Slav things, and of course, Bober kurwa. It's a country everyone has heard of, but few know much about it other than their weird memes and even weirder language.
Grzegorz Brzęczyszczykiewicz.
So, to find out a bit more about Europe's most memed country, we'll delve back into the past and explore its history. So, sit back, relax, get yourself some food if you don't already have it on your plate, and come with me back into the past. God damn it, cheap Chinese bullshit thing, bugging again. The history of Poland begins in ancient times, as both historical and modern-day territories of Poland were settled by ancient tribes that inhabited them throughout various periods and ages. The earliest signs of human activity in the basins of the Vistula and Oder date back to 100,000 BC, and the earliest settlements of the Homo sapiens go back to the period between 8,000 and 5,000 BC. Nevertheless, as time went on in prehistoric Poland, its inhabitants began organizing to larger social groups that eventually would erect large fortifications, as they were subject in part to incursions and raids by various warrior groups from Asia. Later, ancient Poland found itself as a target of raids by Scythians and Sarmatian tribes from the east, and Celtic and Germanic tribes of the west. Oftentimes, the invaders would assimilate with indigenous inhabitants and settle in the conquered territories. In the 6th century, Slavs arrived and settled onto modern-day territories of Poland and quickly became the dominant group in the area, establishing strong administrative centers such as Wislica and Poznan, with the power structures based on tribal assemblies ruled by a chieftain. The Slavs of Poland would prove to be a tough nut to crack, as they withstood repeated invasions by nomadic tribes from Asia and neighboring fellow Slavic principalities of Great Moravia. Around the 9th century, trade rose once again in the region, which contributed to the growth of more settlements. And as trade routes became ever more important, they started to get fortified, while the role of the chieftain, later tribal prince, also increased. This process was most evident in Greater Poland, where the Polanian tribes became the most dominant one. By the 10th century, the Polanians were powerful enough to subjugate their neighboring states and create the first principality on their territory. Throughout the middle and late 10th century, a great amount of modern-day Poland's territory succumbed to the rule of Mieszko I, which became known as the first establishment of a unified Polish state. In an effort to consolidate power, Mieszko became baptized and married the Princess of Bohemia, which is symbolically referred to as the creation of the first Christian Polish state, which enjoyed full protection by the Pope and became one of the biggest players in Europe at the time. His son, Boleslaw the Brave, completed his process by conquering a considerable portion of territory and spreading Christianity among those who were skeptical of Mieszko's baptism. For his efforts, Boleslaw became the new ruler of Poland, which officially became a kingdom in 1025. However, despite his great achievements, his reign was short-lived, as he caught a fatal case of death the same year. Although Poland became unified and got esteemed as a great power in Europe, by the mid-12th century the country became divided amongst its successors, and the country would end up losing its title of kingdom. As Mieszko's bloodline died out in the 14th century, the Poles were forced to look for a king elsewhere in Europe, and after a brief political romance with Hungary, Polish Queen Jadwiga married the Grand Duke of Lithuania, which symbolically represented the beginning of the Union, culminating in the unification of Poland and Lithuania into a single entity appropriately called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I know, a very creative name indeed. Soon after the formation of this medieval superstate, Poland started to get faced with new and more dire challenges that often wore an onion as a hat: the Ottoman Empire. In the 15th century, the rise of the Ottomans cemented them as a new kid on the block and as an existential threat to many European states. Amongst those states was Poland, which thought if nothing was done to prevent the expansion of the Ottomans, they could easily spread to the rest of Europe, especially now after gaining a major foothold in the Balkans. As such, the Holy Roman Pope called for the crusade against the Ottomans, and a coalition of multiple countries led by Poland and Hungary set off to fight them in Varna, modern-day Bulgaria. The battle was a defeat for the coalition forces, and Poland was left without a king for 3 years thereafter. However, although the crusade against the Ottoman ended in disaster for Poland, the upcoming centuries were the exact opposite, as the Kingdom of Poland entered its golden age. During the Polish Golden Age, the country's political system evolved into a democratic monarchy and became one of the first multicultural states in history, where minorities' rights were protected by the laws of the Union. As such, the Commonwealth was a force to be reckoned with in European politics of the time, as it was in a cultural sense as well. The existence of the Commonwealth meant that Poland, for the most part, enjoyed military superiority during its heyday. The most powerful component of its army, the Polish Hussars, were born in the 16th century, out of a need for quick and decisive victories on the battlefield, even when they were heavily outnumbered. The climax of Poland's culmination of power and military might, arguably, was showcased the best in the late 17th century at the Siege of Vienna, when the Polish winged Hussars rained down on the Ottomans, aiding the Germans and Austrians in fending off from the Ottoman scourge once and for all. However, as the famous proverb says, all good things must come to an end, and Poland's golden age was no exception to that. The mid-17th century was the starting point of a slow but painful decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During this time, the Tsardom of Russia, kingdoms of Prussia and Sweden grew ever more powerful and started to present an existential threat to the Polish state and its independence. Alongside this, Ukrainian Cossacks within the Commonwealth's realm also grew ever more so unruly as their desire for independence grew. All of this resulted in the losses of great chunks of territory and political significance for Poland. Not helping the Commonwealth's case were the internal conflicts between its nobles, which exacerbated its already weakened standing for years and decades to come. The Commonwealth was also in a constant state of war for the entire first half of the 16th century, culminating in the Swedish Deluge, when Poland faced a simultaneous invasion by the Swedish, Russian, Prussian, Cossack, and Transylvanian armies, and resulted in the destruction of its capital, Warsaw. Although Poland emerged victorious, the invasion and its consequences left it devastated and even more weakened internally. This state of affairs continued until the mid-18th century, when it became clear the only way out of this situation for Poland was to adopt fundamental reforms. With backing from Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, Stanislaw August Poniatowski became the King of Poland, who juggled between the demands of the Commonwealth's nobles and his Russian ally. His policies brought improvements in the fields of economy, culture, and science, but failed to stop the impending First Polish Partition, which saw the country's outer provinces appropriated by the Russian Empire, the Prussian Kingdom, and the Habsburgs. The decline, despite his reforms, continued, still with no end in sight, and the last-ditch attempt to get the Commonwealth back on its feet through reforms was too ultimately unsuccessful. This turn of events concerned Catherine the Great, and she launched an invasion of the Commonwealth, thereby conducting the Second Polish Partition. Surviving reformists gathered and launched an insurrection against the Russians, which, despite initial success, was quickly suppressed. The failure of the insurrection resulted in the Third Polish Partition, where all of the Commonwealth's territory was divided between the Russians, Prussians, and Habsburgs, which marked the end of the Polish state and its disappearance from maps for the next 123 years.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
Okay, but real quick, you like traveling and I like traveling. Here's me traveling to Japan, and here's me traveling in India, and here's me traveling to Israel and subsequently being detained. Now I'm at the Ben Gurion airport. I've basically had my passport taken away.
Mert elkurtuk. Nem kicsi, nagyon.
Travel is great, but what's not great is getting your flight delayed or cancelled. And that's where today's sponsor comes in, SkyCop. Summer is a busy season for traveling, with everyone looking to leave their post-communist hellholes of commie blocks and hit the sunny beaches. Hell, as you're watching this, I'm out in Dubai right now. But as it's so busy, things are bound to go wrong. Hell, just a couple of months ago, I had my flight cancelled when I was heading to India and had to spend an additional 700 euros on a ticket. However, SkyCop is here for the rescue, as they specialize in assisting you in making a claim for your disrupted flight, and no matter if you're flying into, in, or outside of the EU. With even giving you the potential to receive up to 600 euros for delays over 3 hours or cancellations and overbookings. Although navigating the airline compensation regulation can be difficult, SkyCop is committed to get you what you're owed. Using them is extremely simple, and best of all, you can submit your claim for free. And if you don't win the case, you don't have to pay SkyCop a fee at all. And with additionally fast payouts, there's no reason not to give SkyCop a try. So go and click my link in the description or in the top comment, or scan the QR code in the screen and start your claim process with SkyCop to receive a compensation for up to 600 euros. After the third partition of Poland, each of the three conquerors initiated a policy of denationalization, which targeted Polish citizens aiming to suppress their language, religion, and even culture. A vast majority of the Polish intelligentsia, consisting of scholars and academics, was forced into political exile or to resign from political activity. However, although badly beaten, humiliated, and conquered by its neighbors, the idea of an independent Polish state did not die. The turn of the 19th century brought hope for the Polish nation. In the wake of Napoleon's military success and wars that were unleashed upon Europe because of his antics, the Polish legions wasted no time and took this opportunity to reclaim their independence by joining Napoleon in his battles in Italy, giving significant contributions to his further successes. Napoleon somewhat fulfilled the hopes of the Poles, as after defeating Austria and Prussia, he created the Duchy of Warsaw from parts of the former Polish territories and helped the Poles raise their own army under Prince Józef Poniatowski, who was also the nephew of the last king of Poland. This army fought in all of the major battles of the Napoleonic Wars, but was left to fend for itself in the wake of the fall of Napoleon as a result of the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. As Napoleon was defeated, the Duchy of Warsaw was annexed to Russia and became Kingdom of Poland under its auspices, which had its own constitution, Sejm, aka Parliament, army, and treasury. After the Napoleonic Wars, things were relatively quiet until 1830, when an armed insurrection broke out in the Russian-controlled Poland, which became dubbed as the November Uprising. This insurrection ended in failure, and the Polish people were severely punished by Russia, losing all of their privileges, and the region was put under direct rule of Moscow as a result, further stomping on their cultural practices. This, of course, didn't discourage the Poles, and many more uprisings came to be as a result of tightening measures, which too ended up in failure and more oppressive measures being taken by Russia against the Poles. After the January uprising in 1964 also ended in failure, the Poles were forced to settle for diplomacy in pursuit of their independence rather than with guns. All of this brought wave after wave of Polish political exiles, which became known as the Great Emigration on account of both the number and the intellectual potential of the exiles. Most of the political emigres became involved in European politics and attempted to strive for Polish independence outside of their country. Some did so through diplomatic means, some through military service, and some through secret organizations such as Young Europe. After yet another Polish uprising, deemed as the January Uprising, the Russian Empire stepped up its oppression of the Poles through means such as Russification policies and banning the Polish language from schools and institutions altogether. Likewise, Prussia was following along by attempting the Germanification of Poles living there. In Austria, however, Galicia, the Austrian part of occupied Poland, had its own autonomy and rights, but was severely impoverished compared to Prussian and to a lesser extent its Russian counterparts. The second half of the 19th century, however, brought new life into Polish politics of the time, as new political parties were formed in Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Likewise, Polish deputies held the highest offices and seats in respective parliaments. Polish culture also enjoyed a period of dynamic growth. Many of Poland's greatest writers and painters came to fame during this time period. Significant advances were also made by Poles in the fields of sciences, such as the liquefaction of atmospheric oxygen and nitrogen, as well as a new method of petroleum distillation. However, arguably, the most significant achievement made by a Polish scientist was the discovery of radioactivity and isolation of the first radioactive isotopes.
Po twojej pysznej zupie nie ruszam dupy z klopa.
Nevertheless, despite being held down by the iron fist of foreign powers for over 100 years, the dreams of independence came back to Poland in 1905, with the onset of revolution in Russia. Although no significant changes were made regarding the Polish partition or the empire as a whole, the struggle for independence was revived. Some political groups opted for armed insurrection, while others were opting still for diplomatic measures. However, everyone knew that it would take a pan-European war between the partitioning powers for the success of the independence movement. And so, when a certain Bosnian shot the Austrian Archduke and indirectly triggered World War I, a solution was brought for the issue of the Polish question. Józef Pilsudski, commander of the Polish legions, proposed an alliance with Austria-Hungary and the German Empire, believing they would mop the floor with Russia and then in turn would get defeated by the other members of the Entente, giving rise to a renewed independence of Poland. Incredibly enough, he was right. The Russian Revolution of 1917 forced Russia to withdraw from the war, and Austria-Hungary and the German Empire lost a year later. The Treaty of Versailles ended the war, and as one of the terms, it sanctioned Poland's independence out of ashes of the two fallen empires and granted it access to the Baltic Sea. And so, by October 1918, Polish forces were already disarming the Germans and Austrians, and in early November, a Polish interim government was created, with Ignacy Daszyński, a socialist, as its leader. But the fight was not over yet, as a new conflict was brewing in neighboring Ukraine. After the First World War, an uprising broke out in the Greater Poland region, and Poland was forced to fight the Bolshevik forces in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. The fighting quickly went against Poland's favor, and the Russians were able to reach the outskirts of Warsaw and once again threaten Poland's mere existence. However, despite their best efforts, the Soviet forces narrowly lost in a battle dubbed the Miracle of the Vistula, which brought the Polish-Soviet War to an end and secured Poland's independence from Russia. With Poland's independence safeguarded and the Second Polish Republic created, new agricultural reforms were passed and national administrative bodies were created. The education system and war-damaged industry were also being repaired already by 1920. However, not all was well within the country, as internal tensions culminated in the assassination of the country's first president, a week after his election to the office by an ultra-conservative fanatic. This political turmoil continued well into the mid-1920s, as even radical state finance reforms couldn't alleviate tensions, which continually led to the growing discontent amongst the general public. In May 1926, however, Pilsudski, who was out of politics for 4 years up to that point, executed a coup d'etat together with military units loyal to him and ascended to power. With this began the period in Polish history called the Sankcja regime, or the government of the colonels, as most of Pilsudski's colleagues in the government were retired or active army officers. This regime brought economic stability, but also shifted Poland away from democracy and towards authoritarianism, as Pilsudski governed with an iron fist, tolerating no opposition or dissent, and was known to use drastic methods to curb defiant politicians. Unfortunately, economic stability didn't last long. As the New York stock market crashed in 1932, a new economic crisis was triggered in Poland, which further worsened the already tense atmosphere in Polish politics. Not long after, the Second Polish Republic's existence was interrupted with the onset of the Nazi German invasion on September 1st, 1939, which also triggered the wider World War II. Poland was unable to defend itself, especially so after the USSR under Joseph Stalin joined the war and invaded Poland from the east on September 17, effectively dooming Poland to renewed occupation by the same powers which had occupied it before, albeit this time being even harsher and more oppressive, as the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany both expanded at the expense of Poland. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, a policy of systematic extermination of Poles was applied in both occupation zones, albeit in different ways. While Nazi Germany resorted to concentration camps for both Polish Jews and non-Jewish Poles, killing 3 million Jews and 2 million Poles respectively. The Soviet Union deported the undesirables to labor camps eastward, where at least 250,000 Poles perished. But the Soviets too didn't shy away from utilizing more brutal methods, as was the case with the Katyn massacre, where the Soviets executed around 22,000 Poles and buried their bodies in the forest near the city of Katyn, only officially declassifying documents on the event in the early 90s. Nevertheless, from 1939 until the end of World War II, the territory of Poland was subject to ruthless ethnic cleansing, first by both Germany and the USSR, and later solely by Germany, as in 1941 the Nazis executed an invasion of the Soviet Union as well and took control of the entirety of Poland. The Polish government was forced into exile in London, but did not give up the struggle, as they already began directing the various underground organizations at home, both in political means and via an armed resistance. A fully operational clandestine Polish administrative system known as the Underground State was formed and conducted its affairs. Some of the largest armed resistance organizations of the war were formed in Poland, the Home Army being the most influential in the various partisan operations against its occupier. Poles also fought in other European fronts throughout the Second World War, their most famous contribution being in the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. Back at home in the same year, an uprising arose in Warsaw, directed mostly by the Home Army, with aims to liberate itself from the occupiers. However, it garnered little outside support and ultimately was unsuccessful, with the occupying German army crushing the Polish rebels. As a result, 80% of Warsaw was destroyed and about 150,000 to 200,000 civilians were killed by the German occupational authorities. The German war effort was already declining at that point though, and a final push which disintegrated its grip on Poles was the Oder-Vistula offensive of early 1945. The Nazis had left, but the Poles were not quite free yet, as they came under new management, the Soviet Union. World War II left Poland devastated in ruins, and it would take years, if not decades, for it to properly recover. At the end of the war, Soviet authorities, with the help of Polish communists, quickly crushed all opposition and dissent within the newly formed Poland, which lost its eastern territories to the USSR forever, but was compensated in part by its expansion westwards, gaining territories east of the Oder-Neisse line, which would become the border of Germany and Poland. Then, in 1947, elections were held, which were essentially rigged by the communists, bringing the Polish Workers' Party into power. In 1955, Poland joined the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of European communist states created to counter NATO. Following its accession into the pact, economic hardships coupled with political terror of the Stalinist regime generated discontent among the people, which was ignored until 1956, when the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev promised more civil liberties and a reversal of Stalinist policies in the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Worker strikes and discontent brought changes to Poland, and after the death of the Communist Party's leader, Poland began to curtail the influence of the USSR and was getting back on its feet. In the 1970s, it even enjoyed a period collectively known as phony prosperity, when Poland utilized the Tito strategy, taking out foreign loans which allowed the economy to flourish for a little while, and tolerated to a degree private businesses. The communist economy was nonetheless still inefficient, as the first signs of crisis to come were showing in 1976 due to lower wages and supplies of consumer goods dwindling. Widespread strikes and workers' protests soon followed, from which communist Poland would never recover fully. The real end to Poland's phony prosperity came in 1980, when after another price increase, an extremely strong wave of strikes once again engulfed Poland. This time, the government did not resort to violence, and after a period of negotiations, an agreement was signed, and a new powerful movement emerged. It was an independent trade union called Solidarity, which would quickly become recognized by the state. The movement numbered about 9 million members in its heyday, and was becoming influential in promoting freedom and liberal change in Poland. Solidarity's influence was quickly suppressed in 1983 by the government through means such as intimidation, although it still continued to function immigration illegally. With the fall of the Berlin Wall came the fall of communism in Europe, and Poland was one of the first countries to denounce communism in 1989. Democracy and freedom of speech were restored, and a third Polish Republic was formed in 1990. Despite its eagerness to abandon economic literacy and become a free economy, transition from a communist to a capitalist system was not easy for Poland. Immediately after switching systems, the country suffered tremendous inflation in 1990, which almost numbered 600%. However, through good economic management, this inflation declined yearly until it dropped to only 4% in 2001. The last post-Soviet troops left Poland in 1993, and in March 1999, the country joined NATO after begging and pleading to join, and even threatening to get nukes if they weren't allowed in. But ultimately, they were allowed to join after they threatened to support the Republican Party, which I guess is the only thing worse than having nukes. Following its admission into NATO, Poland also joined the EU in 2004, which marked the true beginning of its economic prosperity, which can be seen today, as Poland has become the leading emerging economy from the ex-Soviet bloc. The country's average life expectancy grew tremendously after abandoning the system. The Polish GDP per capita today reached 11 times the value of what it was in the 90s, and the Polish economy has been reaching record low levels of unemployment. Despite its rocky and often uncertain history, Poland was able to prevail and become a shining gem of Eastern Europe, ever resilient, prosperous, and looking towards the future. Poland is a shining example of how strong a country can be despite all its past adversity and handicaps placed on it by foreign powers. And hopefully they'll continue on their path of prosperity and serve as an example for their brethren who too were stuck behind the Iron Curtain. Polska Góra! Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to smash that like and subscribe button. And if you wish to support my channel, consider buying a shirt from theIronicShop.com or become a member like these lovely people. My name is Janos and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey!